Welcome to the Monocle Banking Podcast, where we go beyond the headlines to unpack the real levers of economic change. As always, I'm your host, Michael Avery, and today we're lifting the hood on one of South Africa's most talked about reform programs, Operation Vulindlela, OV, billed as a blueprint to unblock the arteries of growth in South Africa. Vulindlela has just launched its ambitious Phase 2, promising 30 key structural reforms from energy to logistics, which are well known, to emerging issues, shall we call them, water, visas, digital identity and local government. The big question, though, is what does it learn from Phase 1 and how can we deliver on such an important program in Phase 2? Well, joining me is the man steering the initiative from the centre of government, Rudi Dicks, head of the Vulindlela unit in the Presidency. Rudi, I've got to say, it's great to have you on the show. The country desperately needs OV to succeed when it comes to getting us up to 3.5% growth. We've just had the unemployment numbers released. We were up a full percent from 31.9 to 32.9. And the number of youth unemployed, that keeps me up at night. I'm not going to lie to you. But just kick us off, when we look in the rearview mirror at Phase 1, what were those things when you as a unit sat down and said, right, that really worked in Phase 1 that you're hoping to now bring into, from an operational perspective, into Phase 2?
Well, thank you for inviting me, Michael, to the show, and happy to be part of this conversation. What keeps you up at night keeps me also up at night. I mean, that's another program that I run around youth employment. And, we've had a very interesting conversation a few days ago with a couple of business leaders and government, to break that barrier around employing more people in the economy and young people in particular does require for us to have a sustained level of higher growth, right? And of course, that's important. When we set out in Phase 1, not to decide on a whole suite of programs, we're not good at prioritizing, Michael. You know that I say that upfront, and I say this to ministers as well, that, we tend to think that prioritization is 10 things. No. We decided on 5 key things, and we said, what's in our control? We're not asking anybody else to take an initiative, something that is in our control, and it's largely fiscal neutral, right? And we said, let's focus on the network sector. Let's focus on electricity. And of course, the emerging issue was we're seeing an increase in slowdown in generation capacity, but also the larger reforms. Water, very similarly, around water pricing and the establishment of a proper national water resource agency to be like a SANRAL of water, the SANRAL of roads. We talked about telecommunications, and that was largely around the spectrum auction. The fourth area was around logistics and Transnet in particular, and similarly to the declining performance of its fleet was similarly for rail and ports at logistics, but also just opening up the logistics space for private sector. And lastly was the visa reforms, and we've done fairly well on that, both in telecommunications. And we said then, if we focus on these 5 things, we did a bit of modeling, and the BER guys also did a bit of independent modeling, the Bureau of Economic Research. And we said that could we, build on a 3.5%, and that would be, building on where we're at, and see if that could take us somewhere. And I think the one thing that does keep me up at night is that we've done an immense amount of work. You're familiar with the energy reforms that we've done.
Yeah.
For the first time, we've changed the legislation and allowed for private sector generation to use the network, the transmission network, to transport the electrons from one place to another. We've broken up the single buyer model where Eskom buys up all the generation capacity. That no longer exists. We're doing a market reform. We're going to do EDI reforms. We separated transmission from generation, and that's the first step. We wanted to be fully independent TSO. We auctioned the spectrum. We have a points-based system for the critical skills. We have a remote work visa. We're going to introduce a fully electronic travel authorization system. In the meantime, what we've done is a company visa, which is the trusted employer scheme, which is run by employers. And of course, the water reforms, which are also quite critical. We haven't seen the numbers come through, but we did see a bit of uptick in gross fixed capital formation. We did see a bit of the changes in employment, and we could see that in construction. Because energy, of the potential of the reforms, we could calculate on the model that this did and would continue to unlock about 500 billion rand worth of investments for Phase 1 only. 390 billion of that is energy reforms. So we got to get that done. And as soon as we get the bill done, financial close done, getting billed, dispatching electrons, it's when you get that numbers feeding through. There are constraints around grid and a whole series of other things that we're addressing. But for me, if we can see some of that come through in the economic data, that's, of course, when you have a feather in your cap and you smile from ear to ear and you say, wow, these reforms have had an impact on growth and the kind of growth paradigm that we want at the end of the day. So that's the one thing that keeps me awake. But I think, we haven't seen it come through the growth. And my point here is that, but I think it does lay a good basis for us to be able to ensure that the reform is about creating competition, creating opportunities for private sector in space that we've never had. Open access, for example, on the freight rail network,
Mm,
eyes that will eventually get to RFPs that looks at concessioning and joint ventures in infrastructure in the port and rail space. So a lot of exciting stuff. My biggest sleepless night is that it's not coming through in the data yet. I suppose maybe a little bit more patient, but
yeah.
30 years of democracy, 10 years of very low growth, patience have run dry a little bit, even for me.
Yeah, no, well, exactly. And I think that was going to be my question. How do we square that vision with the
Yeah,
reality of kind of downwardly revised GDP forecast now from Moody's and the IMF and the BER? And that, I suppose, from the outside, one thinks that there's a disconnect between our reform ambition and our economic performance. But, tankers are notoriously difficult to turn. So when do you expect, having laid this base of phase one, to hopefully start to see an uptick in the data that will become something of a self-sustaining boost to confidence, which I think they always say is the cheapest form of stimulus? If you can get business confidence up, consumer confidence, we can see we're heading
yeah,
in the right direction, then entrepreneurial animal spirits are unleashed, people invest, and then you start to see employment increase. And those are the kinds of net positive spin effects that you get from this kind of reform
absolutely.
agenda. So when do you expect to see that?
One of the problems with us being a small open economy, Michael, is that investors, institutional investors, those that look at our markets, don't look at South Africa just from a reform program. They look at South Africa from a risk portfolio, right? You're familiar with that. And they look at a whole series of different things. So they look at exogenous factors like Trump, for example, and the issues relating to the trade debacle and slapping on tariffs. They look at the budget, for example, and the fact that we now have to go to budget three on the
Yeah.
21st of May, right? And then impacts that on confidence, our yield curves go up. They look at a whole series of policy stances and the views that are taken. And then they look at OV also. When you aggregate it and jumble it all together, it still comes out negative in my view. I think those are the kind of things. And I'm hoping that at least some of the positivity that will come through directly in the economy, for example, I'm very excited about the rail reform. I spoke today at the Africa Rail Conference. And one of the things that we've done, I think that would potentially uptick slightly with the generation reforms as soon as we deal with getting through some of those areas is certainly the open access, and that is about basically making slots available on the rail freight. And that's important. I mean, 100 applications for slot sales, right? I think the minister issued the RFI on those particular corridors, including autos and container. And if we can move as quickly as possible to RFPs and go to market, I think if we finally get the legal matter sorted out for Durban Container Terminal 2,
Yeah.
which is still in court. I mean, that's 11.5 billion rand of investments through a JV partnership. Whoever takes it, right? I suppose the asset may be slightly undervalued, but certainly I think given the reform and what it looks like, potentially it may give it opportunity. If we can resolve it, I think that in a sense may just give a little bit of uptick. I'm not going to be optimistic and talk about suddenly seeing an additional 1%. But I think it's sustaining that momentum and engaging with investors on a daily basis. It is about us sustaining that momentum, reporting on it, talking honestly and frankly about the risks, talking honestly and frankly about the gains that we've made, making
Mm.
sure that the reform program has clear line of sight. There's performance management. The president does his job as he has done in ensuring that we keep to the timeframes. I think that's an important part. And again, for example, people were a little bit iffy about it going into GNU, as you can imagine, and other risk factors, and potentially, what happens to the GNU given the budget debacle? Does the reform program fall apart? And I think that kind of surety and insistence that, irrespective of what happens with politicians, this reform program is something that will continue going. I'm hoping that this year we can sustain that momentum and show that the president is continuing with it and we're going to drive the implementation. And like you say, these are huge tankers. Eskom and Transnet. Oh gosh, you got to turn them around. You got to create, market conditions. You got to get private sector in. You got to deal with oligopoly practices. You got to deal with regulators that have to be formed. It's complex, but I
Yeah.
think the sustainability, momentum, and creating confidence that we are on the right path as it's been. Michael, I just wish it comes through a little bit of the growth figures. I think that's what I'm just,
Yeah. Well,
going on my hands and knees on.
As you say, we are a small open economy, and just as you hope that things are turning, then you get these volatile events and, Trump and his tariff wars, and then on again, off again. Finally, we're in a détente, with a pause 90 days with China. And one hopes that global conditions then will improve as well. Now, the finance minister, Enoch Godongwana, he has said that OV Phase 2 will heavily inform the upcoming third budget. So that's obviously a vote of confidence again from Treasury, and you
Absolutely.
work quite closely there. Let's talk about Phase 2, because you're now going to be
Yeah.
focusing on some new areas. And while there are 30 reforms, I don't want to give a misleading impression here. You're still remaining focused, aren't you? Because
Yes.
you're now going for local government. You're looking at spatial inequality and digital transformation in like three
Absolutely.
large
Yeah.
buckets. So it's not like you're saying, well, this has worked in Phase 1, now we're going to become unfocused again. But I want to
No,
stay
no.
with, yeah,
Let me just, before I get into that, important for the listeners to understand. Of the five, four will continue. In actual fact, the fourth one, which is visas, is largely implementation because the minister has adopted all the reforms. The
right.
one thing that we haven't ticked yet is the electronic travel authorization, a fully electronic based visa system, right? And some of us who travel the world, if we go to Turkey, for example, even Zambia, Kenya,
Yeah,
we go to
Kenya.
the,
Yeah,
I mean, they have a fully electronic based system where, you get your acknowledgement in a few hours and you get a visa in a couple of days,
yeah,
electronically based. And
yeah,
so that's the one thing. But it's important for us to carry through the energy, logistics, and the water reforms. That's quite an important part, right? I mean, much of the logistics hasn't been completed at the end of phase one. I mean, I acknowledge that the three additional ones are slightly different, but they're also important for confidence and local government in particular. And this has been a bugbear where we've seen local government performance decline from a service delivery. You and I live in the same community. Our water issues, our electricity distribution issues,
mhm,
potholes, lights that don't work, robots that don't work. And for us, it's going to be important to acknowledge that it's a complex space. There are specific legislative powers, constitutional powers assigned to local government. Versus easy when you have a national shareholder minister for transit and you're able to make a policy decision and you shift that big tanker, as you say, into a particular direction and you create the market space. Here it's much more complex. And there are a few things that we're looking at to try and see how we deal with it. The first is utilities for electricity and water, and specifically creating more efficient and professionalized utilities, ring fence funding. And that's quite critical, right? Professionalization of the staff. We got to look at the revenue models, even for metros, right? Who are relying on conditional grants for much of the infrastructure spend where they're supposed to actually go to the market or use their surpluses much more prudently for those kind of big infrastructure projects. And then, of course, the white paper, which is the context of the changes that are there. So this is going to be a tough reform, and I must be honest and frank about it. It is not going to be easy to say in the way that we've done it for national government, where ministers are accountable from an executive point of view to the president. Here we've got to work very collaboratively with local government. We've got to work very collaboratively with mayors, with provinces, with various entities to ensure that we develop the reform. I must just say quickly that, I think we've had a few successes. eThekwini was a collaborative approach when we had to deal with some of the water issues and some of the service delivery constraints. 1 year later, we've been fairly successful in sustaining that. We're now going to start with the city of Johannesburg. I know this is more recent when the president had visited the city of Johannesburg
mm,
and asked for a presidential intervention. We're working quite closely with the province and with the metro around specific interventions that many of the citizens in the city know precisely what we need to do.
yeah,
And there's
yeah,
been some successes, so we got to work really, really hard on this one. But
yeah,
make no mistake, this is going to be a tough one. Similarly, for spatial inequality, around focusing on demand side housing, rental subsidy, and improving, for example, issues around rail and passenger rail, for example, and particularly transport and bringing citizens much more closer to the places of work
yeah,
or the places of entertainment or education. And the other one, which is really a no-brainer, we should have started this decades ago. It's digital transformation and introducing digital public infrastructure, and transforming the system. Easy things that we did during COVID, digital
yeah.
payments, for example, digital identifications, and the spin-off and efficiencies for ourselves in government and for the private sector is just immense,
Yeah.
as we see what Brazil and India, for example, have done.
Services. And but another one, I mean, you speak about spatial inequality, and we live just outside of the beautiful city of Johannesburg. Downtown CBD has fallen into a terrible state of disrepair.
Yeah,
Don't talk about Breeze Street, but there is an asset there. If you chat to a
absolutely.
lot of people who are very passionate about the city. You look at the Enthovens and what they've done around the Vickyards precinct in Lorentzville with their investment in Nando's. If you look at the Levies and what they've done, if you look at what Liberty and Santa Bank are doing around the Bromfontein precinct, if we could get a handle on the collapse in the CBD, hijack buildings, and start to bring some sense of order and bring people into residential spaces, bring them much closer to their places of work, you get little microeconomies going. What are the big challenges at a local government? But what are the challenges, Rudi, in reaching down through the layers to the state's weakest tier to drive reform? What's your leverage as OV, and what are your biggest risks to execution?
I mean, some of the challenges relates to the capacity, for example, and the capacity constraints that have been rated. The president, for example, cites the importance of creating a professional bureaucracy, appointing the right CFO, appointing the right city manager or municipal manager. You know, that this is important, that you've got to professionalize it. The fact that we've seen declining surpluses, for example, in the metros, we have raised that, through selling of electricity or water, declining because of inefficiencies, Generally, what you've seen, and we use our metro, as you talk about the city of Johannesburg. I mean, it has over the years created those pockets of excellence. Some of the social housing projects just next to the Mandela Bridge, for example.
Yeah.
Some of the investments that the city had made when they developed the banking sector at the back end of the M2 highway and with the Minerals Council and, getting people out onto the streets and cafes. So there's pockets of excellence that still exist and that had existed. And I think that's really that we got to attract the business people. Our
Blue
approach here,
IQ. Yeah.
absolutely. But our approach here has been, for example, to partner through this presidential working group, to partner with the business guys who have formed this Josie My Josie, for example, right?
Yeah.
Where
Yeah.
people like the Eindhovens and people like the Levies and the others who are really interested in seeing inner city rejuvenation, who are looking, for example, at the arts gallery or looking at social housing or looking at aspects of how we can get slumlords out and have, many of the buildings developed into social housing blocks, for example, and create, as you say, that kind of economic and putting that investment. JCA, for example, the Johannesburg Crisis Alliance. And so what we're developing is a strong partnership through the Presidential Johannesburg Working Group with these entities to try and see where we can partner on supporting this. And I think it's been really phenomenal on identifying some of those problems and what role the public sector can play. I mean, for example, issues around potholes. Private sector, Hollard, for example, Discovery, for example, have said, we prepare to put money aside to assist with pothole fixing. Now that's a no-brainer. They're not asking for compensation for it, but certainly they're looking at what can we do to be able to make the roads and the state of the roads much more better. I think there's a really good opportunity to work collaboratively. And the president's, this is the president's kind of legacy, where he collaborates with private sector, collaborates with different stakeholders, NGOs, and different organizations out there to try and identify, fix a problem, and get cracking and implement it. And so it's that style of delivery that we've adopted in OV. And we're hoping that methodology spins off in trying to fix many of the challenges within the city of Johannesburg. There are many other metros as well. Kuruleni, for example, going through challenges. Gqeberha, for example, also going through challenges. And of course, we got to see that. The approach of OV, the first phase in this, is to look at the metros, because 60% of our GDP and 65% of our population lives in the 8 metros. If we extend it slightly to secondary cities, and we talk about 17 municipalities, that's 80%. We're looking at not at all 267 municipalities. We have to be focused. We have to look at where the greatest impact and economic growth is going to happen. And we got to see what is it that we can support. I've got to just say lastly that, please, we're not a bomb squad or a crack team coming in to implement and fix things. It remains the constitutional and legislative mandate of the city to do that. But where the presidency can play a role of convening, bringing partners together, bringing spheres of government, and have that performance management and accountability, I think that's a good recipe for success. And that has worked in Queen and has worked elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, it's worked. If you look at the Cape Town Central City Improvement District, the SIDS as they call them, I chat to a lot of CEOs of listed property funds, and they say that's what's really worked around, the city of Cape Town. Everyone looks at it now and praises what's happening in Cape Town. You forget that in the 90s, there was a real issue in Sea Point, Greenpoint. It was overcome. There were lots of drug dealers in certain areas. It was a no-go zone. Yet with that kind of approach of bringing in the private sector with the political will, they've managed to turn it around. So it's not as if we don't have examples. And your idea of tackling the big metro is very much the Pareto principle, that 80-20
Yeah.
rule. So what are you going to be doing in terms of convening meetings with the right people? Because I think there are more than enough people who would be willing to help business people, NGOs who work in the city, understand these things at a very granular level, to help bring them together and bring them into that political conversation. Because very often when I chat to business leaders, they say, well, we'd love to help at a local government level. We just don't know whose door to knock on.
Just to let you know, in actual fact, we've actually convened them physically into a conversation of what should be the priority focus if you were business people looking at it, or Johannesburg Crisis Alliance, or the academics from WITS and UJ, or any one of the residents' associations in the townships, for example. So we've actually gone already one step further where we're working together and convening the city together. I'm using this as a city example for Johannesburg because, this is where we are. And we've already convened them to look at specific programs. So over and above that, Michael, we are actually working with them. The point about it is that we've got to get to, implementation and successful implementation. It's not something that's up there and talk about, we're going to do this project and that project. What is it that you can do? And the critical question is just how do we make the rules work? Kind of partnership that exists. And the rules are and able to be adaptive, for example, on getting private sector support. In eThekwini, for example, some of the private sector guys took on the responsibility of trying to fix water treatment plants, and we had to find mechanisms for that to happen. Toyota, for example, did a huge amount of work. F&B, for example, I'm raising this because these are the ones who came to the fore and said, we prepared to assist with some of the interventions in eThekwini. And it's about developing more actionable stuff that they can see the benefit for and not having, loose conversations about, okay, we think this could work or that could work. And this is the kind of stuff. So for example, an engagement with the city center, can we fix Alex Main Road, for example, that has potholes the size of a rugby field, or the fact that although it's not a city road, but the fact that Olifantsfontein Road off-ramp onto the N1, that is the bane of the Midrand citizens who have been trying to ask for a long, long time to fix that. A cohesive approach between province and the city to try and deal that with Sandra. Inner city rejuvenation. Can we look at what are the pieces of property that we own from DPWI or from the city or from the province and convert them into forms of social housing and make it attractive for many of the citizens? There isn't any shortage of ideas, and those are committed. We've been convening them. And so if there's anyone out there, you got my details. Ask them to connect with me. We've been sitting there talking about getting people involved in specific projects, and that's quite exciting that the business guys can actually see, we can work with the presidency, we can work with the city of Johannesburg. They've opened up doors for us to be able to ensure that we can provide and support better services of the municipality.
Are you getting a capacity beef up for phase 2? Because, as you say, there's no shortage of good ideas and good intent, but you must obviously also be constrained by your own internal capacity. What is that looking like?
A little bit better, Michael, but as you know, we're on a fiscal squeeze. Ideally, for a unit like our size, we need about 30 to 50 people to be able to do the stuff. Since it's jointly run between ourselves and National Treasury, we have jointly about 25 people that are working on Operation Vulindlela. It's not an ideal size. A lot of it is that we try and get them expertly run. My team just doubled to about, potentially from about 5 to about 13. So small little growth. The methodology and the approach has always been a core team employed by the presidency and knowledge that is out there. Many people, experts in the private sector, experts that used to work in government, former DGs, who have come to me and come to us and asked us, please, I'm willing to work on OV. And it's phenomenal. So we've been able to contracting people. The constraints of the public service, as you know, in getting the right kind of people are always difficult. But when you contract them in on a part-time basis or on a contractual basis for certain things, that has worked. So core team, and a bigger expert team of pool of experts that are available to help us in water logistics. And it's been phenomenal the amount of people that have put up their hands that we've been able to help. We've never been able to do any of this stuff. Those experts have not put up their hand and volunteered to assist us.
And I had Musa Jacks, who used to be in the public sector and Art Anglo-American, talk about their municipal capability and partnership program, which also offers a glimpse of what success looks like when government works hand in hand with the private sector at a municipal level. They helped the Blouberg municipality complete 14 capital projects on time and on budget for the first time. So, it can be done, but it really is about sustaining this momentum. Rudi Dicks, thank you very much candid, clear-eyed, and very much in the arena. Always appreciate your time.
Thank you, Michael.
Well, Operation Vulindlela Phase 2 might just be South Africa's last best shot at systemic economic reform, but it will live or die, not by the quality of its plans, but by the grit of its execution. As the third budget looms and the country's coalition politics evolve, the pressure to deliver has never been higher. Thanks for tuning in to the Monocle Banking Podcast. As always, I'm Michael Avery. Until next time, take care.